Well, let's go ahead and start. Once again, we have a very distinguished group to address us, starting with the woman immediately to my left is Susannah Black, who I had never met physically before, but she is actually one of the editors of Providence Magazine, and her most recent work this past week includes an exchange with her family friend, the actor Richard Dreyfuss, which is a fascinating overview of engagement in public life. And so we're looking forward to hearing from Susannah. Rebeccah Heinrichs, a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, has an article in the current issue of Providence on nuclear weapons. She is a wonderful national security expert, and so we're delighted that she can join us. And finally, Paul Coyers, another one of our contributing editors, also a professor here, or a fellow, I should say, at the Institute on World Politics, research fellow, and a regular writer at Forbes.com, and has written particularly with a special penetration and insight about the role of Russian orthodoxy and Russian foreign policy, which she'll be touching on today. So I believe we're going to start with you, Susannah, if that's your understanding.
Sure.
And we'll take it from there. And we're going to be ending promptly in 1 hour. So let's, everyone could stick to no more than 15 minutes to leave some time for questions after. Thank you.
Hello. I'm astonished and a little bit frightened to be speaking after Dr. Rebeccah on a parallel topic. And the only way that I can dare to do this is that I'm not speaking as an academic, but as a sort of journalist. And what we do is we go from ignorance to knowledge. My experience has been that understanding the Islamic State is essentially a process of revising one's earlier oversimplified ideas in light of the almost infinite number of ways that there are to be wrong. And so I'm calling this getting less wrong about the caliphate. In the days after the Friday the 13th attacks in Paris, a vivid set of images made its way through the media. First, there was the darkened Eiffel Tower, Paris itself in mourning, the gaiety of the city's central Belle Epoque identity in abeyance. Second, there were photographs of iconic structures in cities around the globe, lit up in the blue, white, and red of the tricolor in solidarity. These parallel images, the darkness in one city and the blazing colors in the others, highlight a particular feature of the war that this incarnation of Islamism has declared. It's a war not on one particular nation state, but on what jihadi writing would and does call one of the Crusaders' capitals. IS controls a defined geographical area and has more or less established political structures. The Western powers, nevertheless, don't want to dignify it by calling it a nation state. What we miss, though, is that the dignity that it itself seeks is not the dignity of a nation state. The acronym ISIS, Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, was a misleading one. ISIL, too, is misleading, as this seems to limit the group's ambitions to the Levant. The group has recently changed its self-description to IS, Islamic State, which at least starts to clear things up. But all of these acronyms are also misleading because of the assumptions that we have about the word state. IS does not consider itself a nation state over against Iraq and Syria or over against other nation states. It does not want to join a community of nations. Rush a Muslims to your state, Baghdadi advised fellow believers on being proclaimed caliph in 2014. It is your state. Syria is not for Syrians, and Iraq is not for Iraqis. The land is for the Muslims, all Muslims. In other words, there is no intended overlap between a nation and a state. Rather, the intended overlap is between the global community of all Muslims, the Ummah, and the territory held by Baghdadi's armies. And the territory is not, of course, confined to areas of the Middle East or even to territories like Spain, once held by Muslims and taken back in the rape of Keystone. Baghdadi does not mince words in his call. This is my advice to you. If you hold to it, you will conquer Rome and own the world if the law wills. ISIS is a conventional English language rendition of the Arabic acronym Daesh, D standing for Dawla. Dawla, however, is not well rendered as state. Instead, it is something closer to dynasty or regime. And the kind of regime it is of course, the caliphate. The primary reaction of al-Qaeda, not to mention other less radical political Islamist groups, to Zarqawi's group's original ambiguous declaration of the Islamic State in or of Iraq in 2006, seems to have been embarrassment. Many understood Abu Umar al-Baghdadi to be claiming to be reestablishing the caliphate, or rather having this claimed for him by his handler, Abu Ayyub al-Masri, Zarqawi's successor, a kind of impresario of terror who had cast the first Baghdadi in the role of caliph. There was a slight element of cosplay in this claim, in the view of mainstream jihadis like those in Al-Qaeda Central. It was extreme, overreaching, grandiose. It was as though a great-nephew of Otto von Habsburg, who had grown up in Notting Hill or somewhere, and gotten a doctorate, and had then moved to Vienna and declared the rebirth of the Holy Roman Empire and demanded the allegiance of Heinz Fischer and Jonas Adler and all the people of Austria and Hungary, and set his sights on Prague. ISI, then, failed in the key caliphal point of actually controlling territory. This was not a minor flaw. It was, at that point, an internet state, what you might call the caliphate in speech. And this does not do it. Once you declare the caliphate, you have to behave like a caliphate. Otherwise, you've essentially shot your wad. And many jihadis felt that by 2009, IS had quite definitively done this. Now imagine that our Habsburg claimant had, in the wake of anarchic civil war throughout Central Europe, actually managed to establish a functioning state, to collect taxes, to enforce justice. The implied claim to be a caliphate was silly in 2006. It is not silly now, and it is no longer merely implied. IS is certainly enacting a monopoly on force in the region, taming the other weaker jihadi groups and going a long way to eliminate the anarchic criminality that prevailed in Syria during the civil war. It is also providing many of the other services of a modern state. It picks up trash, it collects taxes, it runs centralized energy services, it beautifies street medians, and it enforces a legal code, a hyper-rigorous version of Sharia, which seems to specialize in finding opportunities to employ the grisliest of the hudud punishments, things like beheading, crucifixion, severing of hands. From what I can tell, for all its harshness, Sharia can be thought of as originally as something of a rescue. The Arabian Peninsula of Muhammad's time was a sea of tribal blood feuds, nearly as chaotic as Syria is now. Sharia in that context was the operating system of civilization, God's revealed law, revealed through the words of the Quran and the example of Muhammad and his companions. Whereas tribalism then, and nation-states now, are chaotic, ad hoc, positivist messes. In enforcing Sharia, there's an element in installing the Code Napoleon over the complex web of local law, and unequal justice and simple anarchy. For those who affirm Sharia today, democracy is, as a political system that coughs up legislators, absurd. It is more than that, it is idolatrous, because it implies that God as lawgiver can have a partner, a human legislator. But a monarch who sought to legislate, to do anything but apply Sharia, would be equally offensive. This is not, again, that a state that seeks to coexist ultimately with other states. Expansion is in its very nature because these jihadis believe God's justice demands that this legal code, enforced by a caliphate, ultimately extend over the earth. To work and fight for this enforcement and extension is the way that human beings are meant to carry out their task in this world. It is a mission that capitalizes on the genuine human mission, as Christians understand it, of reflecting and extending God's rule, God's kingdom over all creation. In other words, the call to ultimately enforce the hudud punishments in Herald Square fits into the spiritual receptors that humans have to form and fill, to be God's vicegerents in the cosmos, somewhat in the way that a retrovirus can co-opt a spot in your DNA. It could almost be thought of as a Muslim version of what in the Christian tradition would be called theonomist postmillennialism. It's just that what this looks like in IS turns out to be quite a bit grislier than anything that Gary DeMar ever imagined. To clarify, it's not as though it's a coincidence that France and Russia have been the targets of recent attacks, or that the US is threatened. IS recognizes that national governments are the decision-making centers of power. Its generals understand the concepts of the Westphalian system, and they act in part using its logic and ideas. But they don't act in agreement with those concepts. Nationalism, indeed, is one of the manifestations of Western decadence that Baghdadi seeks to overturn. He is quoted in the second latest issue of Dabiq, calling for the West to comprehend, hear, and understand the meaning of terrorism which will tranquil the idol of nationalism and uncover its deviant nature. When IS joyfully bulldozed the Sykes-Picot line, there was something in that joy that went beyond the joy we felt in the West when the Berlin Wall fell. It was not that a divided state was now reunited. It was that one example of an illegitimate concept, national boundaries, was eliminated. A key example, a particularly hated and historically resonant one, to be sure, but just one. The point was muddied in the September 11th attacks because bin Laden called the US, in particular, the Great Satan. In its own way, this flattered our vanity. They hate us, we liked to say, for our freedom, and it was a particularly American kind of freedom we had in mind. They probably specifically hate the Connecticut Compromise, or federalism. or the Bill of Rights, or other things we learned about in civics class. The image we had was of jihadis with a beef against James Madison. It's possible to go the same direction with the attack on Paris. They hate France for its laïcité, or they hate it as the birthplace of Charles Martel. But this would be somewhat to miss the point. The point is not that one nation-state attacked another. It is precisely that the caliphate attacked one of the cities in, let's call it the Cosmopolis, the collection of cities that are the capitals of what was once Christendom. In the view of these hardest core of Islamists, surely these two things flow into each other. Christianity is polytheism, idolatry. Is it any wonder that the idolatry of Christendom should have, in the course of history, become the idolatry of the debauched cities of the modern West, the idolatry of the Cosmopolis? IS does not have a particular problem with France, or with the French. It has a problem with the Francs. It is symbolic and emotionally gratifying to say nous sommes tous Parisiens, but it is just a matter of realism to say that we are all Francs. That, anyway, is one way to tell the story, and it's a simple and satisfying one. And it is also, as far as I can tell, true-ish, but there are other things that are true as well, and we can't allow ourselves to ignore these other things. IS would not have existed at all, though the jihadi Salafist movement would, of course, still exist, if the US had not invaded Iraq. There would have been no power vacuum to fill. We knew even in 2003 something about the ideology of jihadism, and the idea that Saddam Hussein was harboring that sort of terrorist made about as much sense as if we'd been told that Castro's government was secretly nurturing a nest of hardcore Carlist aficionados of the traditional Latin Mass in its bosom. It has to be said, not by way, obviously, of shifting blame or anything, but as a caution regarding our last attempt to steer events in the region with American military power. Furthermore, at the risk of stating the incredibly obvious, I'll say this. To say that IS is, quote, not about Islam is silly, but it is not quite as absurd as saying that Islam as a monolithic whole is barbaric or has no alternative mode of expression than IS. What is IS's relationship to Islam considered as a whole? As usual, the short answer seems to be Facebook status. It's complicated. This is what I've been trying in this project to figure out. We can at least say a couple of things. Traditional Islamic jurisprudence, such as that of Ibn Rushd or Ibn Khaldun, is meticulous about not targeting non-combatants, not carrying out the kind of wholesale and indiscriminate attacks that were absolutely characteristic of Al-Qaeda, and which are now to a slightly less degree characteristic of IS. It is meticulous about not spilling Muslim blood. It is also horrified, Muhammad himself was horrified by suicide, and suicide bombing does count as suicide in a way that throwing oneself into battle against impossible odds does not. Suicide bombing, or its equivalent, is simply not a kind of warfare that is, from what I can tell, considered legitimate in most of conservative Muslim jurisprudence through most of Muslim history. And even within the ranks of suicide bombing approving jihadis, IS is something else. This is not your daddy's jihad. Its willingness to engage in a massive purifying war against civilians in its own territory reminds me of nothing so much as the actions of the French Republican armies against the royalist counter-revolutionaries in the Vendée. In its brutality, in its enthusiasm for declaring other Muslims heretics, and in its fusion of the activist/jihadi and apocalyptic/prophetic strands of Muslim political thought. It is controversial, wildly so, even amongst Al-Qaeda supporting jihadi ideologues. Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who is Zarqawi's teacher, has condemned IS for shedding Muslim blood. It has always been mainstream Islamic doctrine to fight physically against external enemies, which France certainly is, in defense of jihad, and at least in principle to establish a caliphate and to expand its borders in offensive jihad. So in one sense, to be too nuanced about this, about the attacks on Paris, is to miss the point, and the original Just So story about IS fighting as Islam against Christendom is true. But it's also true that IS has a deviant ideology, which leads them to fight as well against their fellow Muslims, even their fellow Sunnis, and that it is unusually eager to carry out the program of expansion and conquest. All these things are true. In other words, to understand something like this, what we must not do is to be too either-or in our search for causality. Yes, they attacked Paris because of evil, because of the original sin which we share with them. Yes, those individual men attacked because surely of specific personal histories, loves and hates and desires and ambitions which we will never know. Yes, not for nothing, IS attacked France because the French bombed the territory they claimed. And yes, the Wahhabis attacked the West in a long-game attempt to reverse the carve-up of the Ottoman Empire, to place a bloody exclamation point on their erasure of sex people. And yes, there is this too, that this was Islam attacking Christendom, at least in the understanding of those who were doing the attacking. And surely, male human nature being wonderfully ontologically stable everywhere, there are Muslim men to whom the historical resonance of this struggle speaks, as surely as it speaks to all my male Chestertonian friends. All of you out there who secretly want to sail into battle at the head of a fleet, like Don John of Austria. And if I know this crowd at all, I know there are people here who recognize that in themselves. Though I also suspect it might be slightly worse at a First Things issue release event. And we have to be wiser in our own urge to see the solution to this as reenacting Lepanto. And so we push on, not just through the fog of war, not just through the fog of politics, but through the fog of a political theology, not our own.
Everybody hear me on the way back? Is that good?
Yes.
So I'm as we mentioned, as Mark mentioned earlier, I'm a fellow at Hudson Institute. I specialize in deterrence theory. I'm mostly concerned about nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons. And I have this horrible habit of writing about things that I just need to get off my chest now and again that are in the public discussion, and I have done that on the subject of Syrian refugees, which has led me to be here to talk about this with you. And it does overlap quite a bit with what I study mostly, which is what Russia is doing in the Middle East and how that affects alliances mainly. But what I'd like to talk about today is the Syrian refugee problem, what is going on in Syria, and then ask a question. Does it require the United States to bring in these 10,000 Syrian refugees that President Obama wants to do? So more than 250,000 Syrians have lost their lives in 4.5 years of armed conflict, and 11 million, which is half of the entire Syrian population, have been forced from their homes. Syrian President Assad, his forces, rebels, and a variety of jihadists, everyone thinks it's just ISIS there, that's not true. Al-Qaeda is there as well, but a variety of Islamist forces are all vying for power there now. So the image of the little Syrian boy washed ashore is now deeply associated with the plight of Syrian refugees. If you just Google Syrian refugees, your computer is just going to show you a bunch of just horrible images of human suffering, and mainly focusing on women and children. And then it was with this backdrop that President Obama announced that the United States would be allowing in 10,000 more Syrian refugees. And many politicians waxed eloquently about our founding's immigrant heritage in an effort to win support for the influx of refugees. I kept seeing this quote from George Washington in 1785. He said, quote, "Let the poor, the needy, and oppressed of the earth, and those who want land, resort to the fertile plains of our western country, the second land of promise, and there dwell in peace, fulfilling the first and great commandment," end quote. This sort of became the argument. It is American to bring these Syrian refugees in, and frankly, it is un-American to close our doors. So emotions run high. It makes it difficult to look at the matter with clear eyes, but I think it is certainly worth a try, and that's what I hope to do in just a short time, if I can. So where are we now? What is going on in Syria? Well, pro-democracy protests erupted in March of 2011 in the southern city of Daraa after the government's arrest and torture of some teenagers who painted some revolutionary slogans on a school wall. That was the initial spark. Security forces, after those teenagers were tortured and killed at the hands of the Assad government, security forces opened fire on demonstrators who were protesting this. Killing several, more took to the streets, and you began to see a true, what looked like a revolution happening in Syria. The unrest triggered nationwide protests demanding President Assad's resignation. The government's use of force to crush the dissent nearly hardened the protesters' resolve. And by July of 2011, hundreds of thousands were taking to the streets across the country. Opposition supporters began to take up arms, first to defend themselves and later to actually expel Assad's security forces from their towns. This was a no-kidding civil war that had broken out between what we called moderate forces. We should talk about what we mean when we say that. This is Syria. These are not Democrats, small d. So even the moderate forces who we were talking about who were actually trying to oppose Assad, what they wanted was they wanted somebody less authoritarian than Assad, and they wanted democratic vote to some degree in Syria. And these were the folks that were actually some of them willing to work with American operators in order to overthrow Assad. So, but I do think this point is really important because, especially now in this political climate, we're listening to presidential candidates talk about what's going on in Syria, and Assad has been completely wrongly painted as a strong man who was actually pretty not so bad. He was like Saddam, who was not so bad, and he was like Gaddafi, who was not so bad. Assad is horrible. He is a dictator. He is brutal. He's willing to use chemical weapons on his own people, which I'd like to get to now. And, oh, by the way, this Syrian uprising is indigenous. It was Syrian. This was not the United States trying to kick off a Syrian civil war. It was not our meddling that caused this. This was a Syrian opposition that came up to oppose their own leader. Now, the media began pressing President Obama, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do about it? He said, we're not going to do anything about it at this point. And they said, what might change your mind? What might change your calculus? And he said, quote, we have been very clear to the Assad regime, but also to other players on the ground, that a red line for us is if we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus. That would change the equation, end quote. That red line statement will come back to haunt our president. 1 year later, there was evidence that the Assad regime did use chemical weapons, and then another misinformation narrative began making its way across the United States that actually it wasn't Assad that used chemical weapons. This was the opposition forces had gotten a hold of them. It wasn't Assad. But President Obama's spy agencies went in there, and they actually had indisputable proof that it was the Syrian government. Quoting from a newspaper now, unknown to Syrian officials, U.S. spy agencies recorded each step in the alleged chemical attack, from the extensive preparations to the launching of rockets to the after-action assessments by Syrian officials. Those records and intercepts would become the core of the Obama administration's evidentiary case linking the Syrian government to what one official called an indiscriminate, inconceivable horror, the use of outlawed toxins to kill nearly 1,500 civilians, including at least 426 documented children, end quote. President Obama condemned it and then sought Congress's approval to authorize force to strike back against Assad. The problem was, as is often the problem with our president, he thinks out loud. And he began thinking out loud in front of the American people, to the American people, as to what this would look like. What would American intervention in Syria look like? He didn't know, he wasn't sure, but we would do it. And then we didn't really understand what war termination would look like. Politicians like to say it's not war, it's war. If you're going to use military force, I'm not saying it's all out total war, but it is war once you're using military force in a country. And the president was willing to do this, but was not able to give a clear, compelling case as to what that would look like and what the objectives were, the military objectives were that the United States would be achieving. And so, no surprise, he could not get the support from Congress to authorize the use of force. So he was really in a bind. But lo and behold, he had a hero who came in, and that hero was Vladimir Putin, who proposed brokering a deal with the Syrian dictator that would remove chemical weapons and prevent a military strike by the United States. So here's another player. Russia is Assad's, how do I want to call it? Patriarch. It is their great defender. Vladimir Putin supports Assad. And so, one of the things one of my mentors has told me, Rebeccah, he said, when you watch things happen in international affairs, a lot of people get caught up in what's happening in this region or this region, and it's a very limited understanding. What you want to look at is alliances. Watch alliances. Russia, Syria, Iran, Watch that space. Who would have thought? Oh, so the chemical weapons came in. Let me finish that thought. The chemical weapons were supposedly going to be removed from Syria. The OPCW is the international organization that will remove chemical weapons. So they go into Syria. Here's something to know about the OPCW. It is there at the invitation of the government. Therefore, the chemical weapons that was actually removed from Syria were the chemical weapons that Assad showed the OPCW. One can imagine that Assad did not show the OPCW where all of the chemical weapons were. So when the OPCW declared, we've removed all the chemical weapons, if you look at what they actually said, they removed all the chemical weapons that were disclosed to the OPCW. And so months later, Assad used chemical weapons again. We have seen since that, the media, for some reason, I don't know why, it doesn't really cover this a whole lot, but if you watch, that was not the last time that red line was drawn, and then we saw all this about the chemical weapons. Chemical weapons have been used multiple times since then from the Assad government. There is even some reports, only in the media reports, that, not to my knowledge, the government has not confirmed them, but that ISIS has actually gotten a hold of some chemical weapons that were thought to be left over from Assad, or they could be chlorine chemical weapons that they've made themselves. And so now we have Russia directly intervening militarily in Syria against the will of the United States. Who would have thought, and when this happened, this told me, absolutely, no bones about it, Russia is now the name of the game in Syria. It is not the United States. When Russia began shooting cruise missiles from the sea into Syria, it did so over the airspace of Iraq, supposed to be an ally of the United States. We went in there, we took out Saddam, and we set up its nation government, and here we are with the Iraqis either allowing or powerless, even with the backing of the United States, to prevent the Russians from shooting cruise missiles over its airspace and over the airspace of Iran. Russia did that. So much for the Iran deal, soothing relations between the United States and Iran. So although Russia now claims to be fighting ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Syria, U.S. officials say that about 70% of Russian airstrikes have targeted more moderate Syrian rebel groups, including some supported by the United States. It is believed that more than 1,000 civilians have been killed. Remember, this is just in the last several months when Russia went into Syria. More than 1,000 civilians have been killed by Russian indiscriminate airstrikes. And now General Breedlove, he's the combatant commander of European Command, just testified before the Senate a few days ago, has said that over 25,000 foreign fighters have traveled to Syria to enlist with Islamist terrorist forces, including at least 4,500 Westerners. So this is the environment in which we find ourselves. A country war-torn in which it is almost impossible at this point to identify a side worth supporting to a significant degree. So what about those immigrants looking for peace? As you can imagine, it's quite difficult to really get a good handle on the loyalties of the refugees. But there was one seemingly balanced survey that made headlines. I'm a big skeptic of polls. I think polls are, they can tell the story that you want it to tell. But I thought this one was interesting because it was done by the Arab Opinion Index team, and it conducted a poll to try to understand the opinions of the Syrian refugees and also just Muslims across the Middle East. And it conducted this poll, and then it sort of hailed it as proof that the Syrian refugees were benign and were harmless. It said that, quote, only 13% of Syrian refugees had a positive or somewhat positive view of ISIS. Only 13%. Doesn't sound so bad. 13 is a pretty low number. It also found, which the media never picked up, that 10%, an additional 10%, had a negative to some extent opinion of ISIS. Not exactly a denouncement, only negative to some extent. So 23% of refugees polled had either a positive, somewhat positive, or negative to some degree opinion of the Islamic State. So if we allow 10,000 refugees in from Syria, some of them will certainly be children, of course, but still 23% have at least some sympathies or at least some understanding towards ISIS. But I hate to break it to the human rights groups, ISIS, as I already talked about, is not the only power player. And so the study did not ask how many of the refugees had sympathies towards Assad. What about Al-Qaeda? You get the point. These folks are not Democrats with a small d. Okay, so, but do they like the United States? Are they at least sympathetic to the United States or the West? Do they yearn for freedom, like that Washington quote, and pluralism? Bill Frelich, the director of the Refugee Rights Program for Human Rights Watch, said, quote, "Overwhelmingly, we are talking about people who are seeking protection and bear no ill will, and I would say, in fact, bear gratitude to anyone who's willing to help them," end quote. If that is true, it is not backed by the facts and the evidence before us. That same poll that I mentioned also asked Syrian refugees who they believe is at fault for creating ISIS. 66% said that ISIS is a product of foreign actors, and the overwhelming majority is opposed to the United States being involved in Syria or the region at all. And given the conservative, anti-secular Western nature of many devout Muslims of modern day, many Muslim communities do not assimilate well, and instead form pockets, and in some cases whole communities. So it does seem as though there is substantial evidence, at least, that admitting refugees from Syria is simply taking on a risk that is just too great. But what about this original question I posed about the lofty sentiments expressed by the founders that many like to quote? Weren't the founding fathers pro-immigrant? Isn't it an American idea to be pro-immigrant? I think the short answer is yes, it is. But the founders did not throw prudence to the wind when they held this position. They understood better than anybody, certainly better than we do today, that countries were not merely countries due to geographic borders, although that is important. Countries were also held together by common heritages, traditions, political institutions, mores, and immigration here, and definitely citizenship, were weighty privileges. And it did not come without conditions, and so it was very important to the founders that immigrants assimilated and abandoned previous loyalties to their governments. I thought this was an interesting example in my research. The founders were especially concerned at the time about non-English immigrants, like the Germans, the French, and the Dutch. You gotta watch out for those Germans, those Heinrichses especially. But they did not, because the Germans, the French, and the Dutch, they did not share the same heritage or traditions with the English or even with each other. Notably, these immigrants settled together in large groups, preserving for some time their own cultures and habits, and they did not mix well with the rest of the population. Jefferson thought, quote, "They should distribute themselves sparsely among the natives for quicker amalgamation," end quote. Washington agreed and thought that by settling in groups, immigrants would, quote, "retain the language, habits, and principles, good or bad, which they bring with them, whereas by an intermixture with our people, they or their descendants get assimilated to our customs, measures, and laws, in a word, soon become one people," end quote. So in conclusion, and I hope we'll have time for questions, having a pro-immigrant posture is truly American. I have one myself. I get in trouble sometimes. I speak in these women's groups, and I'll talk about this issue. And as soon as I start talking about immigration, everybody thinks that I'm lost my mind because I'm so pro-immigrant, because I'm so pro-immigrant. But immigration to the United States is a privilege, and so I believe there are conditions on immigration. And we do not do a good job of assimilating people well who come to the United States. It is a right, it is not a right, it is a privilege, and there is ample evidence to suggest the risk for accepting more Syrian refugees at this time is simply unwise. And so I've told many of my humanitarian friends who are still concerned about the plight of Syrian refugees. There are many of NGOs who are doing wonderful work taking care of refugees overseas in camps, and I highly recommend contributing to the work that they're doing. Samaritan's Purse and the IMB are both two that I commend to my friends. Thank you.
I am going to take a little bit of a different tack on things. I'm going to talk on something that I'm assuming Rebeccah's more accustomed to researching, actually Russia's role in the Middle East, and particularly the intersection between the Russian Orthodox Church, how it's influenced Vladimir Putin's foreign policy, and how that has interacted historically from the Tsar's days up to today in a rather consistent line of Russian policy and interaction with the Middle East. So what we're seeing now is not in any way unique. The intersection of religion and geopolitics tends not to get a lot of attention among Western foreign policy elites here in Washington and in Europe, which tend to be overly secular and not extremely comfortable with religion. I've heard somebody say once, and I think they're right, that it's the idea of trying to interact with religion and take account of it as it shapes statecraft of countries around the world, including of our own. And people that believe in religion, among many in the State Department, it's kind of like if you have a devout faith, you're also the kind of person that believes in dancing unicorns and leprechauns. That's almost the sense you get sometimes. It's not something they're really comfortable with, which makes it difficult to get a grasp on what's going on in the Middle East. But the role of religion in this case, and particularly Russia's age-old perception of itself as a defender of Christianity in the Middle East, has been a key feature in Russia's response to events in Syria and in Iraq, as well as in Russia's current tensions with Turkey. The sense of Russia's responsibility for Christians in the Middle East is closely tied to the Russian sense of itself as the Third Rome. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of that term before. And as the defender of traditional Christian values in general, I'm sure you've seen Putin. And many of the people around him in the Kremlin, particularly a gentleman named Alexander Dugin, have made a lot of statements to that fact and tried to position themselves as defenders of traditional Christian values, and that connects with what they're doing in the Middle East. And then also the close relationship between the Russian state and the Russian Orthodox Church. There's a term for it called symphonia that came from the Byzantine Empire, and Russia has adopted that, and it kind of denotes church and state pulling together like two horses pulling a carrot, sort of, going in the same direction harmoniously. And that's the concept that they have. Putin's move to close coordination with the Russian Orthodox Church to sacralize the Russian national identity has been a key factor in shaping the increasingly authoritarian bent of Russian government under Putin, strengthening his public support, which he's needed to appeal to this sacralized sense of national identity in order to strengthen public support. When people first protested it coming back to the presidency after Medvedev, then with the price of oil tanking and the impact of Western sanctions, the economy going down the tubes, he's really needed to bolster that. This is one of the key ways he's done that. During the days of the Tsar, the Russian ruler was seen as God's chosen ruler of a Russian nation tasked with representing a unique set of values embodied by Russian Orthodoxy. And the Russian Tsar was then referred to and revered as the Holy Orthodox Tsar. Today, you see the same thing. Putin is referred to in many circles in Russia, not all that surprisingly given the history, as people have actually used that term, the Holy Orthodox Tsar. He's not a czar, but he's fulfilling that role in many ways. The church, for its part, and you may already know some of this, acts as the Russian state's soft power arm. So Putin has tried to boost the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church around the world to that end. That was one of the reasons behind the meeting recently between Francis and Kirill. It wasn't just a feel-good meeting in an attempt to try to bridge a 1,000-year-old divide within Christianity. There was a lot of geopolitics going on behind the scenes, and Putin had some very real goals for that meeting. The messianic and apocalyptic character of the Russian narrative about its role in the world today has been around, as I've indicated, a long time. When Constantinople, the capital of a weakened Byzantine Empire, fell to Muslim armies in 1453, Russia began to see itself as the inheritor of that mantle. So their view was that the first Rome had fallen, the second Rome, Constantinople, had fallen to the Muslims. Moscow was left to pick up the pieces and be what they call Third Rome. So that's what that means. Russia, therefore, perceived itself as inheriting all that the Christian Byzantine Empire stood for, all the values, all the dreams, and the visions seen in such texts, and this is interesting, as the apocryphal Apocalypse of Daniel. I suspect that many of you hadn't heard of that, but it's a key factor in Russia's self-perception. This text predicted the coming of a future Constantine who would liberate Orthodox Christian world from, quote, the sons of Hagar, in other words, Muslims. During the Russo-Ottoman War, and there were many of them, between 1768 and 1774, Catherine the Great actually christened one of her grandsons Constantine in reference to this prophecy. So my point is that this mindset has been around and has been defining this rational sense of national mission for a long, long time. Imperial Russia's claim back then, as today, to be the patron of Orthodox Christendom, targeted mainly its major regional rival at the time, the Ottoman Empire. Following the Ottoman defeat in the Russo-Turkish War that I just mentioned, there was a treaty called Küçük-Kaynarca, which was a critical turning point in Russia's role in the Middle East and also in Russia's reach around the Black Sea region strategically. It gave Russia access to the Black Sea, gave it the Crimean Peninsula, but it also was a turning point in Russia's relations with the Middle East and with the Ottoman Empire, because Russia was granted by the Ottomans, who lost, the legal right to intervene within their citizens' affairs within the Ottoman Empire on behalf of Christians. Russia took that and ran that as far as they could take it, and intervened constantly with the goal of, not just for pious purposes, obviously, but the goal to eat away at the power of the Ottoman Empire. And that was one of the factors that, over time, did eat away at the Ottoman Empire, together with Russian encroaches from the north, so that it gradually weakened. Russia was one of the big predators at that time, and used religion in order to justify that. Over the following decades, Russia used that increasingly to meddle in the Sultan's relations with his Orthodox subjects in particular, undermining Ottoman sovereignty, and producing a lot of friction between Russia and the Ottomans that resulted in several wars between them and the Crimean War, which we'll get to in just a minute. In the 19th century, Orthodox believers in the Ottoman Empire were relatively happy that Russia pledged to look after their interests. Similarly, Imperial France was trying to look after and claim protection over Catholics in the Ottoman Empire. And patronage efforts based on co-religionist status went both ways. The Ottomans did the same thing with the Russians. They tried to stoke anger at the Tsar among the Tatars, among the other Muslim peoples of the Crimea and around the Black Sea. So they were both doing it to each other. Russia just happened to be better at it. As I mentioned, there were major wars. Let's go up to, because our time is rather short, let's go up to the Crimean War, which was another major turning point. The Crimean War pitted the Russians, on the one hand, against the British, the French, and the Ottomans. That might seem to be kind of strange bedfellows. In many ways it was. The Brits, the French, and the Ottomans against the Russians. The Russians had hoped, under Tsar Nicholas I, when he had when he'd been a crown prince, he had gone in the 1820s to London, made a grand tour of the other European capitals, and he had tried to get everybody to side with Russia against the Ottomans. Britain, as I'm sure you're all aware, they always had this view that they were the balancing power in Europe. They didn't want to see anyone get hegemony over Europe, and they were afraid that Tsarist Russia could do that. It was expanding so quickly at that time. So therefore, Britain, as a balancing act, sided with the Ottomans. The French, for their own reasons, sided with the Ottomans. So we move up to the Korean War, started in 1853. That's one obvious example where geopolitics and religion intertwine quite powerfully. Russia, for its part, as I said, believed that God had given it a mission to protect Orthodox Christian believers. There's a really good book for anybody who wants to follow up on this. There's a guy named Orlando Figes. He's a professor of history at Birkbeck College, University of London. He wrote a book, I think about 3 years ago, called Crimea, the Last Crusade, which defines well what the war was about. It wasn't just about geopolitics. It was also about religion. And the book highlights well the Russian sense of messianic destiny, and it's important to us today, I think, for obvious reasons. We see it very powerfully today still. So this isn't just abstract, dusty history. The Tsar Nicholas I, there's another parallel between him and Putin I want to bring out. He had been viewed, when he did his tour of the European capitals in the 1820s, as an enlightened young liberal ruler. When he became the Tsar, everyone was quite disappointed because he turned out to be anything but. He turned out to be autocratic. He turned out to crack down on anybody that remotely threatened him, hung a lot of people, shot a lot of people, and set himself at variance with the rest of the European powers. The Europeans were hoping it might liberalize Russia and put it on a Western path to enlightenment. It sounds kind of similar to what we were hoping would happen with Russia in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin. Then came Putin. Another parallel is that under Nicholas I, the Russian Empire expanded to its greatest geographical extent. It was seemingly, on the surface, getting more and more powerful, when actually the foundations of the power were being undermined at the time. So that most of the most insightful geopolitical analysts at the time noticed that both politically and economically, the Russian Empire foundations were weakening, which is kind of similar to what we see today with Vladimir Putin. You see someone who's seemingly made Russia mighty again and strong again, bringing back Russian pride, but at the same time, he's laid the foundations for serious problems in the future, which are going to harm not only Russia as a state, but also the rest of us. If Russia implodes, we're all going to be in trouble. So, going back to the 1850s, the Russians lost. During the war, both sides tried to stir up their co-religionist brethren in the other person's lands. Neither side did so extremely effectively. One of the long-term effects of this war, however, is to reinforce the sense that we see in Russia today, that it's being ganged up on, this sense that everyone's against it. Russia was quite angered by the fact that two European Christian powers allied with Muslims against the Holy Russian Empire. That really incensed them. That sense of grievance has been with them a long time. Throughout the rest of the 19th century, Russia continued to meddle with used Christians in the Ottoman Empire to continue to try to weaken it. Fast forward to the First World War, and there's a gentleman at Baylor named Philip Jenkins who's written another book about the Crimean War, and one of the things he talks about is how that pseudo-Daniel apocalyptic apocryphal book guided Russian actions all the way to the end of the Tsarist era, and including being one of the motivating factors for Russia being involved in the First World War, not against the Germans, but that was a motivation for fighting the Ottomans. The most spectacular efforts to employ the geopolitics of religion were made by the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. In 1914, the Sheikh al-Islam, who oversaw the empire's religious affairs, issued 5 fatwas, translated into many languages, urging Muslims in the British, French, and Russian empires to revolt. In some cases, Ottoman agents distributed not only pan-Islamic pamphlets, but also rifles, so they actually tried to help them. Same time, Russia tried to stir up the Sultan's Christian minorities. Neither side were very successful. But my point is that what we're seeing today is not at all new. What we're seeing is the linkage, in the linkage of sectarian and secular interests, is a return to the classic geopolitics of religion in the Middle East that has been dominant for a long, long time. Christians moving up to today in authoritarian Muslim regimes such as Syria had learned over time to deal with police states in which they lived, such as Assad's, and survive. They weren't thriving necessarily, but they were surviving. The Arab Spring brought about a major change in that it brought about the collapse of these authoritarian regimes that had kept a lid on the hatreds that had been brewing for centuries between various ethnic and religious groups, thus making Christian groups more vulnerable. And again, this isn't to defend those regimes. As Rebeccah said, they were indeed heinous. It's just one of the side effects, however, was that it made Christian groups somewhat more vulnerable because of the chaos that followed in each of these states. The ancientness of ties between Russia and the Russian Orthodox Church and between the Orthodox believers in Syria are coming into play now today. One is the close relationship between the Patriarchate of Moscow, led by Patriarch Kirill, and the Patriarchate of Antioch, which, as you probably know, was one of the 4 ancient centers of Christianity. We had a center at Alexandria in Egypt, Constantinople, Rome, and Antioch. So today, there's still a religious access, you can call it, which is also geopolitical access, between Moscow and Damascus that is more than just a relationship between Assad and Putin. It's also the relationship between Kirill and the Russian Orthodox Church with the Orthodox believers in Antioch and in Damascus. You can see that in numerous ways. There have been many visits back and forth. There is something called the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society, which many of you probably haven't heard of. They've been very active. They're based in Russia. They sent 70 tons of aid to Damascus in 2013. Also, a check for $1.3 million came from the Russian Orthodox Church. Kirill has visited Aleppo in 2011. Patriarch John X of Antioch visited Moscow 2 years ago, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, there's close historical ties between these two seas, which you can see, again, parallel the geopolitical alignment there. Many Syrian and Iraqi Christians are thankful for Russia's more muscular role in the Syrian conflict, which you can understand, particularly given the fact that Washington and Europe seems to have been relatively deaf to their plight. I'm going to fast forward past some of this because we're running out of time. Suffice it to say there's close relationships between the Orthodox believers and believers in general with the Russian Orthodox Church, and Putin has played that up. One of the things Putin has done in playing up his role as the protector of Christians in Syria and Iraq is to contrast the claimed effectiveness of Russian actions in Syria with the inaction of the West to help Syrians. This plays well into the Kremlin's narrative that Vladimir Putin and Russia in general represents traditional Christian values over against Islamic radicalism, as well as against the politically correct secularism that we see in the West. Moscow accuses us, of course not without some justification, of abdicating the values upon which Western civilization was based. Not that Putin represents those values, but that's his propaganda. It's interesting, if any of you read the RT, Russia Today, just for entertainment value, it is entertaining. But it also gives you some insight into the Russian mindset. And one of the things that their writers who are very close to the Kremlin have said, one of them is, there's a gentleman who criticized the United States as thinking of itself as God's own country while highlighting the hypocrisy of ignoring the plight of Middle Eastern Christians. That can resonate with some of us as having a kernel of truth. However, again, Putin is hardly an exemplar of Christian virtue. In 2012, just to show how much Putin has tried to play this aspect of things up, he vowed in a public meeting in the Russian Orthodox Church, Putin did, that the protection of persecuted Christians all over the world would be a key issue in his foreign policy. The Russian Orthodox Church has strongly supported Kremlin's actions in Syria. That's kind of given them a bad eye, just like their support of his actions in Ukraine has, because of all the horrendous things that have taken place in both those areas. As Rebeccah said, there's been many civilian deaths because of Russian bombing in Syria. Likewise in the Ukraine, we all know by now, a lot of bad things have happened. The Russian Orthodox Church has been given a black eye because of that. So Kirill has kind of had to play a balancing act between supporting his patron, Putin, and at the same time not being so close that the Russian Orthodox Church has such a black eye that people are disgusted with it. So I will try to finish up here quickly because I'm already running past what I should have. Let's move up to the meeting in Havana, and I'll try to finish up shortly after that. As I mentioned when we started, the meeting between Francis and Kirill, it looked purely on the surface, and much of the media treated it as such, as an attempt to bridge a 1,000-year-old chasm between Eastern Orthodoxy and the Latin Church. Aside from the fact that was not the first time that the Pope had met with an Eastern Orthodox leader, there was a lot more going on than that, and I would argue that the main purpose behind the meeting was geopolitical. So there is one of RT's many interesting journalists was a gentleman who admitted that the purpose of the meeting was not ecclesiology or theology. It was actually for Third Rome, Moscow, to meet with First Rome, Rome itself, to neutralize the effects of Second Rome, in this case Constantinople/Istanbul, Turkey. So a lot of what's going on with that meeting was Russia trying to neutralize Turkey's effective action in Syria and in the Middle East. The Kremlin was hoping that Francis would put his stamp of approval on Russia's use of air power in Syria, which Moscow has portrayed as primarily, and the Russian Orthodox Church especially has written a lot about this, giving theological cover to the Kremlin and calling it a just war. In gaining France's support, Kirill and Putin's goal was not merely to undercut Turkey, but also the West more generally, of course, because they were contrasting Russia's supposedly effective actions with the West's inaction, as I mentioned before, but also to give Russia the moral high ground and the Russian Orthodox Church moral high ground, which it had lost because of Ukraine. It would also Putin also hoped that such a joint statement that the two issued would put pressure on the West to collaborate with Russia in Syria. And of course, as we all know, one of Russia's chief goals has been to get the United States in particular, but all of Europe as well, to collaborate with Russia on Russia's terms so that they could maintain their base in Tartus, that they could maintain their geostrategic position in Syria. And the meeting with the Pope was one way of doing that, claiming the moral high ground, trying to maneuver us in a position where we have to accept that. Given Russia's long-held sense of messianic national identity as Holy Russia, and its long history of playing a role of defender of Christians in the Middle East, and of using that role for reaching its geostrategic goals, we should not be surprised that Russia is reprising that role today. It would be good if the U.S. and the Western allies were taking these religious factors into account as they attempted to determine an effective course of action in Syria, one that could counter both Russian geostrategic goals and also at the same time more effectively defend the rights of Christians under threat in Syria and in Iraq. Unfortunately, we're not doing that. I still have a page left, and we're over time, so I'm going to end there. The bottom line is we need to have a more effective response, and this goes a bit to what Sebastian Gorka talked about as well when he talked about how in our foreign policy making elite, and John, I know you served in the Foreign Service, so I'm sure you can relate to this, it's very hard to grasp the role of religion and spiritual values in geopolitics. And we need to do better at that if we're going to get a handle both on how to fight Islam, radical Islam, and ISIS, but also on how to counteract Russia, because it's a very deeply embedded part of Russia's sense of national identity that informs their actions in that part of the world. Let's start with questions.
Rebeccah has to leave in 5 minutes. If there's a Rebeccah-directed question, let's do that now. Mark, do you have a Rebeccah question?
Yes. You're talking about the chemical weapons in Syria, and specifically chlorine, which, if I understand right, is not considered a chemical weapon to be disbanded. Is that right? Or
Yeah, it's in pools.
It's in pools. Okay.
Yeah, and I say that because we think that might be where they're actually getting it from. As ISIS kind of moves through, they're actually taking chlorine from these facilities and weaponizing the chemical.
So how easy, so they're going in and getting the pools. How easy is it for them to weaponize it?
It's hard.
Okay.
It's hard to do, but they're. It appears as though they're doing it. It looks like they've used chemical weapons against the Kurds, and with the Germans who are helping the Kurds. There has been some casualties there from chemical weapons.
How effective is it in military use?
It's not the most effective way to do it, but it's a terror weapon, and that's why we think about them as strategic weapons rather than conventional weapons, because they're indiscriminate. Very painful, and they're horrible ways to inflict pain and death on the enemy.
Rebeccah,
Sure.
I'm sorry. I don't know your last name. I'm a student here finishing out, and one of my areas of interest has been post-conflict stabilization. And to me, I understand I work on the Hill. I understand the political will is not there, but just looking at it academically, to me, Syria and Iraq as well are perfect solutions for kind of what we did in the Balkans in the 90s. We kind of go in there, separate the fighting, and essentially try to keep the ethnic groups from clashing. That might be a better solution than trying to absorb all of these refugees who have completely different values and cultural worldviews.
Yeah. If I could talk for another 20 minutes, what I would say is I would give my recommendation for so what should the United States do in Syria? One of the best things, if Christians here in the United States are upset about the refugees, like I said, you can donate to NGOs who are doing great work. And I'm not being flip about that. I mean, like, they truly are doing great work, and you can funnel your resources there, and that's a great way to do it. If the United States government, the best thing the United States government can do at this point is to help out Assad. Assad is the main source of the terror that's occurring in Syria.
And also checks Russia.
Well, here the problem that we're embroiled in now is that it would actually be a proxy war with Russia should we do that, because Russia is actually enforcing some no-fly zones in some parts of Syria. It's hard to comment on where we go from here, because I do believe this administration has lost so many opportunities to do something that it's gotten out of hand. If we had assisted in the opposition forces in the beginning, we would not be where we are today. And it's the same with the Green Movement in Iran. We could have assisted that movement. So, but your first point I think is good. What I try to talk to people about is there's a difference between the protracted nation building that we attempted in Iraq and stability operations that are always going to be required anytime the United States intervenes. We can't just go kill people, break things, and leave.
We could, but it'd be a little messy.
It's not effective,
Right.
And then we'll just end up there in a year or two, or we won't leave the place better off than it was.
Right.
So, stability operations are going to be a part of it, but I will say that it would go a long way politically if those who are arguing in favor of this intervention to admit that we need to take lessons learned from Iraq and not make the same mistakes and overshoot the military and political objectives in the region.
Any other questions?
I have questions for the ones who talked about empires and religion.
Sure.
Who's going to take out the Christian religion? Anybody?
I'm sorry?
Who's going to take out the Christian religion? Americans are saying we're taking out the Muslims. Who's going to take out the Christians?
Hopefully nobody.
Yeah.
I would say hopefully nobody.
Other than the Muslims, the atheists.
Well, we live in a pluralistic society in which we believe that we need to protect all religions that will respect the religions of one another. So as long as we're doing that, we should protect the rights of atheists and Muslims and Christians living in the United States. Does anybody have a different question? Yes.
I have a question for Dr. Coyer. With the Ecumenical Council coming up later this year, I think, do you think there's a likelihood that Kirill is going to try and subordinate all of Orthodoxy, using that as an opportunity or vehicle to do it, away from the real patriarch of
By the real, you mean the ecumenical patriarch of Bartholomew, yeah. No, Russia already succeeded in getting that meeting moved from Istanbul to Crete, partly because they saw it on neutral ground, and they see Bartholomew as being too pro-Western and too pro-American and too pro-Turkish at the same time. All those things make him anathema for them. At the same time, they're trying not to alienate him because they don't want him to recognize a completely independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And hundreds, if not thousands, of local parishes have been leaving the Moscow Patriarchate. They have been Ukrainian Orthodox churches, but ecclesiologically, they are under the authority of Moscow. And obviously, Putin's actions in Ukraine have alienated many Ukrainians. And so they've been leaving, and they've been going to the Kievan Orthodox Church, the Kievan Patriarchate. And that, however, that patriarchate is not recognized as autocephalous or independent by Bartholomew. However, he's been hinting that he wants to recognize it as such. So Kirill is kind of dancing a fine line between trying to neutralize Bartholomew and because he has to toe the line of the Turkish government to a certain degree, and because he is pro-Turkish. And also, they don't want to alienate him to such a degree that he's going to recognize an independent Orthodox Church in Ukraine, because once that happens, right now the Russian Orthodox Church is like 68 to 70% of total Eastern Orthodox churches answer to Kirill. That gives them an enormous outsized influence in Eastern Orthodoxy. If the Ukrainian Orthodox Church would leave the Moscow Patriarchate, that would immediately demote Kirill to minority status within Orthodoxy. And therefore, obviously, that would have big implications for Putin's use of the Russian Orthodox Church as a soft power arm.
Well, we've had some wonderful presentations, and fortunately, they're going to appear in video format on the Institute of World Politics website next week, I'm told. And the Periscope video version should appear on the Providence website by tomorrow, would you say? Joseph, so look for that, and we hope that all of the presentations in text format will appear on the Providence website or in our hard copy version in the coming days, weeks, or months. So thank you again for attending, and if you don't have a copy of Providence, there are some extra copies out in the lobby, so please grab one. Thank you.